You're listening to the MLCC On the Road podcast, brought to you by the Michigan Liquor Control Commission.
Welcome back to the MLCC On the Road podcast. I'm Sara Weber, and with me today is David Marvin.
Hello, Sara. How are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
Doing well.
All right. What are we doing today?
Well, today we are going to talk about a list of 8 tips for people that are submitting a license application to the MLCC. And this comes from a document that I put together with the the Institute of Continuing Legal Education down at the University of Michigan several years ago. And it was just a little tip sheet that they have, I believe, on their website. The Institute for Continuing Legal Education, they handle continuing education credits for attorneys, so that have to do a certain number of credit hours every year to continue their licensure. And this was one of their tip sheets that they had on there.
That's amazing. And I know that you had done an interview for them earlier. Was it last year?
It was 2 years ago,
2 years ago now?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah.
And I did one even longer than that. I'm not going to date myself, but it's a great group of people. And they are actually, I think, one of the reasons why you and I wanted to start a podcast to begin with, because going down there and recording with those people, and they were so friendly and encouraging. And it's a great resource for anyone who needs that type of information or needs those credits. So maybe what we can do is at the end of this podcast, we'll include some information on accessing the Continuing Legal Education Institute. Yep. And if anybody who is listening today needs that information, we'll have that for them.
Yes, we can do that. And I will also put a list of these 8 tips in the description of the podcast. Tip number 1 on our list, and you will notice a pattern here that all of the tips start with the letter C. That was sort of by accident, but then about the 6th tip, I decided the last few also needed to start with a C.
It was an accident on
It was by accident. So, tip number 1 is check out the checklist. The most commonly used MLCC application forms have a comprehensive checklist of required forms, fees, and documents on the first page, or contain a checklist built right into the form on the less common application forms. When applying for a new license or to transfer an existing license, consulting the checklist will help reduce the number of notices of deficiency to which you may need to respond with missed documents that might have been overlooked. So, Sara, let's unpack a little bit about this very first tip.
Essentially, you're going to want to look at the application. Read through it before you start trying to fill it out. There's a lot of information on there. I think there's a lot of people who tend to be overwhelmed by what can be contained in these applications. So going through that initial checklist, reading through it, make sure that you have what you need there first before you start going in and filling it out will be helpful. The other aspect of this that I want to touch on a little bit is when David mentions the number of notices of deficiency. What that means internally is that we're stopping your application because we need something from you. That is what a notice of deficiency is. It sounds like a bad term. It's not meant to be. It's just us letting you know, hey, we have your application here. There's things that are not quite right with it, and we're going to need some additional information before we can move the application forward.
And a fun fact about the term notice of deficiency, the reason we use that is because that is actually what those types of letters that we send to you are called legally in the Liquor Control Code. It talks about us sending a notice of deficiency to the applicant or the licensee. So that's why we use that funny long word or funny phrase for just a letter or an email that says this is what you need to give to us. It doesn't mean you're deficient in the sense of you're not a good qualified applicant. It just means that there is something that's lacking in that application. And those checklists on that very first page of our bigger applications, they're quite lengthy, so they're a separate page. You don't have to send the checklist in. Occasionally we get people that have checked everything off. It's not an official part of the application that you have to submit to us, but it contains a lot of information, and it may reference other forms that you may need to fill out. And it's just a good list to get you to where you need to go, because it's interesting how often we will receive an application that is missing multiple of the items that were on the checklist that are necessary. And people will be like, well, I didn't know that I needed that. And right there on the very first page, it says, hey, you need a lease agreement, or hey, you need your articles of incorporation. And so familiarizing yourself with that checklist before you get going will hopefully save you many steps down the road and can speed the process along.
Another interesting thing of note for the application forms is that they will calculate the fees for you. If you download the application form from our website, open it using Adobe Acrobat, and begin filling it out that way, as you enter information in on the application form, the fees will calculate for you and provide you with the total amount that is due at the time that you submit your application.
Yes, and that has been a very helpful component of those forms for many years. Actually, Sarah, you used to, years ago, manage those forms and put those together, and then that got handed off to me about
Lucky
a decade
you.
ago, and it was always struggling trying to make those fees calculate. And when we finally uncovered the secret that we were told never could be done, and then when we did it, we were very excited because it's a resource that even our staff uses. Sometimes they'll go out
It's a time saver.
and press the buttons to calculate the fees and double check themselves.
Yep. And, for those of you unfamiliar, the reason why we're saying it can be a little confusing is some of those fees are based on sales or a percentage of a license application fee for a license. So it's not a straight number in some cases.
Right.
All right, you ready for tip number 2?
I am ready for tip number 2.
All right.
Tip number 2, correct names. Keep the process on track. While following the checklist of required forms and documents will help ensure a completed application, double-checking the names on the forms and documents will also help keep the application moving smoothly. The MLCC receives a large number of applications that have the wrong names appearing on the forms or documents. The most common scenario where the names are incorrect are on standardized purchase agreement forms used by real estate companies. Leases are another document where incorrect names are often listed. The names of the individual stockholders or members often appear on these documents instead of the applicant corporation or limited liability company. In this same vein, confirm that the correct signatures appear on all the forms and documents.
And we're not trying to pick on you real estate brokers by any means or anyone else who's entering into a lease. What we're saying there is a trade name or a DBA or a person's individual name, if they are going to be licensed under a specific entity, has to be listed. If you have filed articles of incorporation or filed articles of organization for your LLC, we need to have those names listed properly on your documentation, your purchase agreements, your leases, so we can make sure that we are issuing the license to the correct party.
Back when I was an analyst, I was always surprised on what you would see for names on things, and you would need to get an affidavit, or you would need to get an amendment or something that spelled out what it was. And I think the most common thing is when you have a licensee who owns a piece of property, the licensed premises, as an individual, and then they are leasing that licensed premises to their company. A lot of times there's going to be just a lease agreement between the individuals, or they're renting from somebody else, and they've been renting this. They're just getting a license at a place where they have been in business for many years, and maybe the lease has always been in their individual name. And so those are things that are very common, where notices of deficiency will go back to applicants. And just a simple check to make sure all those names are correct will save a lot of time. I think that's a very large number of corrections that are needed because of that.
And you touch on something interesting too. We see this a lot for our club licensees or your VFW halls. Some of those articles that were filed are decades old. And, so you have to make sure that what you filed under is what you are going to apply under as well. So we can match that up in the system and make sure that we have the right company too, because each entity that files is given a specific filing number through corporations and securities. We have to make sure that those numbers are the same when we are entering your information into the system, so we have the correct entity that we are licensing as well. So
correct.
It's a little interesting for, so if you go in and try to change or refile, then that results in other issues too, which we won't get into today. But just make sure that what you filed under is the name that you've applied under. You ready for tip number 3?
I am ready for tip number 3.
All
Tip
right.
number 3, confirm whether individual or trust. Trusts holding interest in a licensed corporation or limited liability company have become a popular trend in recent years. However, the MLCC often encounters applications that have an individual named as a stockholder or member when, in fact, a trust holds the interest. If discovered during the application process, changing the individuals over to their trusts is simpler than if a license is already approved and issued. When reported after a license has been issued, moving the interest from an individual stockholder or member to a trust will be treated the same as transferring interest in a license. Tip 3 is actually kind of in the same vein as tip number 2, where we need to have the correct names on the applications. I just separated this out because it's something that I personally have seen multiple times, and unfortunately we have scenarios where we find out maybe somebody has a license in their corporate name and they're adding something onto their license, or they're adding another licensed location, and they send us in a document that says there's this trust there, and we have no knowledge of this trust being there. And I don't know how many times we've heard, well, it's always been this way.
And it could very well be. And I know you and I have talked about this before, so I'm going to give everyone else a little bit of a brief history lesson. And I hate dating myself like this, but I'm going to anyway. Once upon a time, the commission did not really recognize a trust if the stockholder or member was a trustee of their own trust. And this was many moons ago. That has since changed. We've looked, with tax laws and everything changing throughout the years, there are reasons why now we have to have that information. So we could very well have information, especially if these are longtime licensees of ours, where they've always had that trust. So we have to look at that on a case-by-case basis. But I do think it's important to note that historically, it wasn't like that in the past, but it has changed now. So if you have a trust and the licensed business is an asset of that trust, we need to be notified of it, and you will need to provide that documentation. We do not need a full trust. I want to make that very clear. We need a certificate of trust, existence and authority. It has basic information. We do have that information on our website as well. If you have any questions, reach out to our office, and we will be glad to go over that with you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was some good historical reference, because since I've been here with the commission about 10 years, it's always been we needed the trust. But I think I've encountered many of them because of the prior
right.
the prior process.
Yep. It's confusing.
Yeah.
You ready for tip number 4?
And here we go with tip number 4. And this one's a little bit longer. Convictions omitted cause concern. Each new applicant must be fingerprinted. The MLCC receives a criminal history report generated from the Michigan State Police and FBI sources if an applicant has any criminal history. While the MLCC may deny an applicant for criminal history, more often what causes a larger concern stems from an applicant omitting information about criminal history on the application form. A common misconception exists that criminal history will not appear on a report after a certain period of time, and applicants will not report older conviction history because of this. Applicants may also submit a written statement along with the application to explain any conviction history, the steps the applicant has taken to address the conviction, and why the applicant believes the conviction would not impede the applicant from operating a licensed business safely and in compliance with the law.
And that's a lot to unpack for anyone. The general consensus here is that if you have anything and if you're unsure, report it. There's avenues that you as an applicant, or if you're an attorney or another party that is assisting a licensee in the process, you can run iChats. You can look at other things. I think there's a small charge for that, using that, but you can look at that before you fill out your application. And if there's things that appear on there that you have concerns about, or you thought maybe should have been expunged, or you were told they would be expunged, there's a process for cleaning up that history as well. And we do have all of that information on our website if you have questions, or that will walk you through the process. Otherwise, it is really important to make sure that you're putting that information on the application, regardless of how old it is or how minor you think that it would be. Again, I've seen countless denials because of the failure to report. That is a primary concern for the commission. Yeah. If you don't admit to something on there, it doesn't matter how trivial, it's important because that's the commission's first look at you as an applicant, and that's how that comes across is, were you fair in your reporting of your application, or did we find out about something after the fact? And that's where we want to start off on a good foot with an applicant or a licensee, that the commission knows that you have been truthful right from the get-go. They are able to consider that and any mitigating factors that go along with it.
Yeah. And I will tell you, I think some of it has been clouded there was some legislation a few years ago that I think it was called the Clean Slate Law, where a number of types of violations, criminal violations, were automatically expunged. And then there was a number where you had to go in and ask for it to be expunged. And I think there was a misconception, and I've talked to a number of people that have called in about these sorts of things, where they just thought it automatically went away when they didn't know that they had to actually go in and apply to have certain things done. I just last week talked to an attorney who called in and said, hey, I have got one of my clients who had a felony conviction from a couple decades ago, it sounded like, and they had it expunged. He said, but I'm concerned because it was expunged so recently that it may still show up on fingerprint reports. He said, what do I do in that situation? And I said, your best bet, and I think what you're probably is just be upfront. Report it, put it in your cover letter that this is what took place. And he had all the paperwork for the expungement. I said, send that in. That's going to give the commission a snapshot of what's going on there. And even if it no longer needs to legally show up on your criminal violation report and it's completely gone, there are times where that information is not reported to the central database where the fingerprint reports go through. And I know there's been many times where we've had people come in with, here's my expungement paperwork, and yet we're still showing that they have a conviction out there that hasn't been expunged. So it's more of an issue of just, as Sara said, that initial relationship, that initial understanding of how you are applying, and that you're being upfront and truthful on the application. We don't want to shame anybody. This is not about putting anybody on the spot for a conviction you may have had years ago, a conviction you may have had recently. We're not here to prosecute that again. We just need to make sure, because the law requires us to take it into consideration, that we have the full picture in front of us.
And we don't talk about that on the record during the licensing meetings, too. I want to be clear with that. We are not going to parade a history on an open meeting. It is looked at, and they will discuss it in a very discreet manner. So that is something that to consider, too. Be truthful. We're not going to rake you across the coals on it and during an open licensing meeting. All right. And I know that you covered something a little bit a minute ago, but this leads us into tip 5.
Tip 5 is probably one of the things I tell people more than anything else. It probably should have been tip 1, but it really didn't fit that way chronologically in my mind. Tip 5, cover it in your cover letter. The purpose of most applications submitted to the MLCC will be self-evident when submitted with the correct forms and documents. However, if you have an application that has an uncommon or unique aspect to it, make sure to elaborate on the intent in a cover letter. The cover letter will assist MLCC staff in the review of the application and will help clarify more complex applications that do not fit into the normal application mold.
A cover letter is one of my favorites as well, and mainly because when I worked in the units over the years, that is the first item that I would actually look at or look for when we got an application package in, because again, that tells you a lot of what you need to know of what they're applying for, if someone has passed away, if there's some judgments that we need to be aware of, if they're looking to add space, if they got married. Stuff like that is not necessarily typical of what you would see in an application form, or it's something in addition to what they're doing that is really important for it to be flagged for the staff so we can see it and we can do something with that information in addition to just reviewing an application. So if there are specific nuances to what you're trying to do with your business, make sure that you do prepare a cover letter or have your attorney prepare a cover letter so there is a good explanation, and we're not surprised when it gets into the field. Our investigators do a great job of walking through the application with you, but if they have a little bit of foresight before they head out to your establishment to go over your investigation with you and do a walkthrough of what the premises is going to be, they have that information on hand too. So if there's anything that they need to do or bring along with them, they are prepared as well.
I had a call just yesterday from an attorney, and ultimately what I told him is put it in his cover letter. What the situation was is many years ago, there was a licensed business that had an address that has been on our records for, from what I could see, at least 2 decades. That area got annexed many years ago, and we have record of that. But what we never got record of, because it happened after the fact, was they changed the address. It went from a state highway to a named street in this village. And he's like, this is not the address. You go to Google, it shows this as the address. You go to everything else, it shows the incorrect address, but the correct address actually is this other address. What his concern was, if I put that new address on there, the MLCC is going to think this is a transfer of location when it's staying in the very same spot. I said, hey, you've got all the documentation. Put it in your cover letter. Explain what took place. Provide that documentation from the city and the assessor showing the new address. And that's going to save so much time, because otherwise, you don't put that in there, we're going to go, what's going on? You're going to get a notice of deficiency saying, this appears to be a transfer of location. Can you give us some more information?
Right.
Where now we're going to have that information up front. We can put a correct address transaction into our system so that we know when that is finally issued, assuming that it's approved at the end, we're going to have the correct address on that.
Yep.
And that's a real world example of how that is a perfect example.
Well, and you touch on something important here too, because, when a property is annexed, there's usually a reason for that between two different governmental units, and that's something that the commission also needs to be aware of. Mm-hmm. We have to have that documentation so we can update records in our office to reflect where that business actually belongs at now. And this is something that could be an entire conversation for another day. But anyone from a local municipality listening today, if you do annexations, the state of Michigan, specifically the Liquor Control Commission, if you have businesses impacted by that, we need to know, and we need documentation from you on that. Very important. So. Yes.
Well, because it affects funds
revenues
and revenue and
exactly.
Just quotas,
exactly.
A lot of things that a lot of people would not even take into consideration and even think about if there was an annexation. And you're right, that we could do probably an hour worth of conversation on that.
Yes. Well, for another day.
All
right. Tip 6.
This kind of goes with our
just
annexation conversation, but not exactly. Tip 6, consult with the locals. Applications for new on-premises retailer licenses and manufacturer tasting room permits or licenses require local legislative approval, except in the city of Detroit. However, even for the many other types of liquor license applications that do not require specific local legislative approval, it is always advisable to reach out to the local governmental unit to ensure compliance with local liquor ordinances, along with local health, building, and zoning regulations. The issuance of a liquor license does not exempt a licensed business from compliance with local ordinances, and failure to comply could result in a violation against the business.
This is a very important one for many different reasons that really, I don't want to say involve our office, but it will impact you as a licensee or a potential licensee. Many local governmental units have their own licensing process as well. We do notify every governmental unit when a file is authorized out for investigation, regardless of whether or not we need a resolution from them. We do notify them of your pending application, so they can respond to you or they can respond to us with any feedback that they want to provide. But it is very important that you are working with your local municipality to let them know what kind of business you're trying to bring in, make sure that there are no issues with zoning or ordinances or the approvals that they have to do on their end. The commission is the ultimate party responsible for issuing a liquor license. That does not equate to you being able to use that license. if you fail to meet those zoning ordinances at the local level. A good example of this, I've had municipalities reach out to us in the past that have concerns over licenses that have been issued in their governmental unit, and were not under the impression that we had notified them timely because the applicants hadn't done things on their end. So we've had to explain this process to them as well, and provide documentation that we did in fact send that. All of our information is typically emailed to the clerk's office, to the attention of that clerk in that governmental unit. So if you are not receiving that information, or you're unsure if those acknowledgement letters have been received by your office, double check your email address that's listed on your website, because that's where our staff pulls that information from and sends those notifications.
As an applicant for a license, or a current licensee that may be adding on another license or a certain permit, those folks there at your local governmental unit, they're public servants, and they have a job to do. And being able to reach out to them and have that conversation up front may save you a lot of time on the back end, so that there's not a miscommunication as to what you're looking to do. I think in most cases, it's very rare that we get an objection to a license, because most cases applicants are already working with their local units of government. But there are times where they haven't done that, and it may cause some concerns. And the commission in some cases is required to deny a license depending on how the local government unit may object to a license. And we don't want to be in that position. We don't do many of those in a year. But it does happen. But it does happen. And if that conversation could be had well in advance and things worked out, then it makes it simpler for everybody. And the local unit of government has its concerns addressed. The commission knows that the licensee or the applicant is going to follow those local ordinances, and things will go a lot smoother.
And that kind of is a good segue into tip 7.
Tip 7, communicate with churches or schools. For liquor licenses that allow the sale of alcoholic liquor at retail, most applications for new licenses or the transfer of location of existing licenses will require a determination of whether the proposed licensed premises will reside within 500 feet of a church or a school. If the proposed premises fall within the 500-foot limit, the church or school may object to the issuance of the license. Often, applicants do not communicate with nearby churches or schools before applying, only to hear that the church or school objected to the application midway through the process, which requires the MLCC to conduct a special hearing. Communicating your plans with a neighboring church or school early on in the process will help establish an amicable relationship and often prevents an objection to the application.
There's a specific way that these are measured, which is laid out in statute. We have information on our website as well that covers all of that information, and it will be verified by an enforcement investigator and reported to the commission. So if they find it out in the field, we are required to send notice, and we have to provide a certain amount of time for that church or school to respond, and that is monitored very closely. We take it very seriously, and it can delay the application process. You are able to usually look up that information on a website or use Google, before you file your application. So it might be a helpful tool, because you don't always know if something in your neighborhood is a church or school, especially if you're not familiar with that neighborhood. If you don't live there and you're bringing a new business enterprise in, talk to the neighbors, talk to the community leaders, get that information ahead of time, and start doing some community outreach, and that will help you along the way.
Yeah, ultimately, this tip is more about being a good neighbor and a good
steward.
A good steward of an asset, the license that is granted by the state of Michigan for you to sell alcohol, and it is a privilege. And we encourage folks to be good neighbors and to have those conversations up front with the local churches and schools, even ones that are further away than 500 feet, just to make sure that there's an understanding there that you as a licensee are going to keep people safe in the neighborhood to the extent that you can, and especially with a controlled substance like alcohol. And that will help you in the long run, hopefully not have to have an objection, but not so much just to avoid the objection, but to build that relationship so that there's a trust there between you and the neighborhood churches and the community and the schools.
Well, and that leads us to our final tip.
Tip number 8, compile financial documents in advance. The MLCC investigators assigned to review and investigate applications will request to see financial documents such as tax returns, bank statements, and loan documents to verify the source of funding for a proposed business. Because of its personal nature, this information should never be submitted with the application, but you should have it ready for the meeting with the investigator. The investigator will send a list of items to be reviewed prior to the meeting. Not having the documents ready can delay the investigation and processing of the application and may even result in a denial if the documents are not provided.
I want to reiterate the fact that we do not want your financial documents submitted with your application. We cannot have that information. If you submit your tax returns or bank statements with your application, they will be returned to you or they will be destroyed. Our staff is prohibited from having that type of information, so we want to make sure that we are very clear that it is something that you need to have on hand to provide to your investigator. Those are not even included in the file when it comes back for consideration. They are all reviewed by the investigator. That is noted in their report that they reviewed it and that they verified it, but we don't want to have that in your permanent licensing file if we can avoid it.
This tip is kind of different than the other 7 because this is more of a after the application has been submitted kind of tip, but it's something that while you are working on all the documents and while you're gathering everything and submitting that application on the front end, it's not going to be too much after the application gets done being processed by the licensing division that it will go out to the enforcement division. So it's a good thing to have those documents ready to go, because there's been many times where we've sent something out for an investigation and the investigator reaches out and can't get something, can't even get a interview set up because the applicant's not ready. They're still gathering this information. They got the application in. Maybe they got the cart in front of the horse a little bit. They wanted to get that application out there, and there's been denials because people haven't had a completed application when the investigator gets out there. And these are documents that if you're ready to go, have them ready. It was more of a tip for that step after the application, but it's something that should be done. And again, looking back at some of these earlier tips, make sure the names are correct, make sure addresses are correct, make sure the right signatures are on them so that there's less of a lag time once the investigator gets out, because people want their investigations done quickly and they want to get an application through and approved and a license issued. But these are things that will help speed that process along right from the beginning, as opposed to having to play catch up all the way along.
And make sure if you have any third parties involved in your process on the back end for, a money lender or a landlord that you're working with closely that may need to come out and have information verified by the investigator, make sure they're going to be available. I know enforcement tries to work as quickly as they can on these licensing investigations, but they are also under a deadline. So once they receive this, they have a certain amount of time that they would like to try to get these done in. And if they can't get them done within a certain time frame, they are going to come back to Lansing as an incomplete file, and the commission will ultimately deny it for that reason. We can't hold on to them indefinitely, unfortunately. It just doesn't work that way with enforcement assignments. The other thing I want to point out, too, that I think is really critical with your application is the money. We don't have an online portal to submit an application. There are 2 avenues right now for an application that requires payment. You can either mail it with a check or a money order, or you can fax your entire application to a secured line to our revenue office. We cannot accept your application over email. If you submit anything over email and it has a credit card form that you have completed, we have to immediately destroy that. We cannot take any part of that application. The entire document has to be destroyed. We are prohibited from receiving any type of confidential payment information over email. It could ultimately impact our ability to even process applications by the revenue office if we are caught with that information. It's extremely important to make sure that you are not trying to submit that information to our office. And I feel bad because yes, we still have to use fax machines in that case. Revenue Services is not part of liquor control. In the past, they were in our building, and I think people kind of get that confused sometimes that, if you accidentally send a check in with the application, that we can just run it downstairs and have the staff process it. It's not like that anymore. Revenue Services is in a completely different building. They are responsible for processing payments that are not just for liquor control, but for other departments as well. So they have a lot of information that's coming in on a daily basis. We could have added probably another tip to that. If you're sending payment in, make sure it's with your application. Don't just send us a credit card form and with no information, because they're not going to be able to necessarily process that information. And ultimately, you're going to have to get your money back. And that can take a while. I know I've unloaded like 3 different things with payments right now, so I'm hoping that I'm not causing too much confusion here, but it is important to note that we can't have your confidential information. I don't want your credit card number. Send it to the secure fax line where staff that are authorized to view that information can process that. One final note on payments, and then I'll leave it alone for now. The Revenue Office also has a deposit box that you can use during business hours. So if you want to drive to Lansing, or you're near enough to Lansing that you can do that, you can put it in their Dropbox and they'll process it. Otherwise, they do also have an in-person appointment scheduling process, and we have that information on our website as well.
Well, thank you, Sarah. We'll call that tip number 9.
9 3/4.
9 3/4. There we go. I like 9 3/4. There was a little bit more than just one tip there.
I'm going to throw in a final tip for everyone. We're going to call this one tip 10. If you have any questions, call our office. Use our website. Send us an email. We are always willing to answer your questions. If you're unsure on your application, the process, what the status is, ask us. Contact us directly. We are more than happy to help you. And with that, I think we're good for today, don't you?
Thank you very much for joining us today, listening to the MLCC On the Road podcast, and we'll talk to you again soon. The MLCC On the Road podcast was brought to you by the Michigan Liquor Control Commission. For more information on the Michigan Liquor Control Commission, please visit our website at michigan.gov/LCC. Thank you for listening.